I think a lot of this, like getting back to the diet stuff, a lot of this, the diet hacks and stuff like that, it's people trying to shortcut that painful process. But that process is where you are going to learn so much about yourself and where the actual fulfillment is.
So that kind of brings me on to Ozempic.
Okay.
Because obviously that's a big subject at the moment with dieting, which is, we're talking about, quote unquote shortcuts here. What's your opinion on Ozempic?
Okay, I think I'm going to give a very balanced view of this.
Okay.
Overall, I think it's a net positive. And here's why. So go 100 years back, 200 years back, whatever. Very rarely did you see an obese person, right? It was just, we didn't have such crazy access to hyper palatable, extremely energy dense foods, right? Even go back 60 years, right? If you wanted a cake or a cookie, you had to go to the bakery. There was barriers to get there. Now we are surrounded 24/7 with unlimited access to cheap, calorie-dense, hyper-palatable foods. And again, we know people who tend to become more obese have a greater reward response to food. Here's the real tough part, and where you can tie it back to addiction, right? So imagine you were a gambling addict. And I said, well, we don't want you to gamble so much, but you got to gamble a couple times a day. We don't want you to drink so much, but you got to drink a couple times a day. Don't do blow so much, but you got to do it a couple times a day. Now, I mean, again, people argue about food addiction. Is there really food addiction? Is there not? But imagine being somebody who struggles with appetite regulation, but knowing you have to eat. You can't just not eat, right? So I think if we look at the actual data on Ozempic, what we're talking about, just to give the background biochemistry, are GLP-1 mimetics. GLP-1 is a hormone that's secreted by your gut in response to feeding, and it acts on the GI to tell you you're full, and it also acts on your brain to tell you that you're full, to decrease your appetite. And these things work very well. We see, on average, about a 15 to 20% reduction in body weight in the studies. So pretty much the most effective anti-obesity treatment that's ever been created. Now, GLP-1 itself, its half-life is only a couple minutes. But what they've done is they modify the protein so that now the half-life is much, much longer. So it has the opportunity to act on the brain and the gut for a much longer period of time. And again, very effective. So what are the potential downsides?
What does that do to the body then? So that they've extended the sort of half-life of the protein, and then that means that I feel satiated for longer?
Oh, yeah. So
I don't feel hungry.
Yeah, in fact, it can be such a powerful effect. A lot of people, it feels like almost nauseating. Like you hear, again, every drug has side effects, right? Some people initially get nausea, vomiting, that sort of thing. It tends to decrease with time. But on an anecdotal level, I've talked to people who've done the drug, and they've said that some have said, even after they stopped, the best way they described it is, I don't have the food noise anymore. I'm not always thinking about food, or I'm not thinking about food nearly as much. It calmed it down for me.
Even after they'd stopped?
For some people, even after they'd stopped.
Okay.
So perhaps there's some long-term changes to the brain chemistry that happen. We're not sure. Or perhaps they just got more confident because they lost some weight and realized, because it's not increasing your metabolism. That's one thing to point out. So I've had some people say, I have a slow metabolism, so I've got to take Ozempic. And I'm like, well, you're going to be disappointed because it's acting on the appetite side of things. So some people will say, well, the devil's advocate argument is, well, they could just eat less. Right. But if it was that easy, people would just be doing it, right? So some of the criticisms of the drug are, well, we see a lot of lean mass loss. I don't know if you've heard that.
Yeah,
some people have said
muscle
that.
Muscle mass. Yeah.
I don't think that's as much of a concern as some people do. And the reason is most of these studies with GLP-1 mimetics, the people aren't resistance training. And so if you look at studies where people aren't resistance training and they just diet and they're not like they're normal protein, not high protein, you see anywhere from like a 30% to 40% of the weight they lose is from lean mass. And Ozempic it's right about in that area, which makes sense because they're eating less. And if they're not resistance training or eating high protein, again, they're feeling very full. So hard to eat high protein because protein tends to be quite satiating. So I don't see that as being like more necessarily at risk for lean mass loss. I think what I would say that could be problematic is if people are so full, they may not be choosing the most healthful food choices because they feel full. If they just end up eating less of the foods they'd normally eat, these calorie-dense, hyperpalatable foods, and they don't modify their habits, when they get off of it, they may be prone to regain. And so I look at this as I am, if I have to pick, I'm on board with these. Just say it should be done in conjunction with nutritional counseling and lifestyle modification, right? Like encouraging people to exercise, educating them on healthy food choices. Then I think it's a great option for a lot of people.
Do you think there's enough data, especially when we think about sort of long-term studies on the impact of Ozempic? Because one of the things I've come to believe in life is that there's no such thing as a free lunch. And this sounds too much like a free lunch to me right now, So
here's what I'll say. We don't have, long-term 10, 20-year data. Some people said, well, there's a risk of thyroid cancer. I think that was from like some kind of rodent study where they were using a much higher dose than normal. I tell people, be very careful. Less than 50% of animal studies end up translating into like actual human outcomes. What did we say earlier? There's no solutions. There's only trade-offs.
Yeah.
So maybe there is some side effect, some downstream effect that may have a negative effect. If it helps somebody lose 50, 100 pounds, I'm still going to bet that it's a net positive, right? Could it have been better if they did it through diet and exercise alone? Maybe, but most of those people weren't going to get there anyway, or it's going to be really, really tough for them to get there. It's funny because a lot of fitness industry people are very, very much against this drug. And then they tell you what fat burner that you can buy with the discount code in their bio. And I'm like, wait, this math doesn't math to me. So your fat burner that probably doesn't work, okay. This drug that actually works, not okay. Make it make sense.